Hi there. I want to do a 2-week review to kind of help you think about where you've been and where you might be going in this class, try to make sense of the work, and also give you a little bit of a guide of what you should be thinking about. So this is a review of the first 2 weeks, and then we'll take a sneak peek ahead. I'm mostly going to be using your own work and then explaining some of the features of the class. So if we go back just to day one, right, thinking about the syllabus, a reminder, this is an online asynchronous class, which means we don't have weekly meetings. That means that you really have the burden to keep up with the work and to try to do that work during the week that it's assigned. So if you fall behind, you can definitely email me and we can talk. We can set up a Zoom meeting and try to help you out. But again, this is your responsibility and your burden to stay up to date as much as you can. And so far, really, the big things you should have done is you should have ordered the book, and you should have done that. Ideally, you would have done that before the class started, right? But I know that that can be difficult for some people, and so you should be doing that now. So I gave some time to help you for those who have the book, right, that you got your work done, and then those who are still waiting for it or haven't bought it yet, you had a little bit of time to try to get that taken care of. Until it becomes absolutely critical by week 3 next week. Now, also we did lose a couple students who were unable to complete any of the assignments in the first 2 weeks, but most of you did. So thank you for doing that. And the other thing that I kind of asked you to do is to start getting used to using the discussion board as a place to try out your ideas, but also to see whether you're able to follow instructions. The more accurately you follow the instructions, the easier it will be for everybody because you'll be actually answering the questions that were asked of you, and that really benefits the students who pay attention and are able to use the materials. In other words, this isn't a class where you Google something and copy and paste it into the discussion board and you think you'll get credit. You also will need to have the book in this class. It's exceedingly important that you have the book for this class because that's how it's designed, and I've been teaching this class for a long time. And so I do need you to do that. You'll see also that in the book, in the reader, you're going to start to have a different way of thinking, and then also some new language. And so we're going to think about that a bit today as well. And so that's just the basic idea. You kind of now see how you're going to be using the discussion board. You're going to be using the book, and then I do give you some extra credit papers. Already you've had 2 options, and then also you'll be using some Google Forms for quizzes and things like that. Now, there was a little bit of confusion. A couple students had some confusion with using rubrics. I totally understand that. It seemed like for those who thought, I put 2 student comments here, for those of you who think that the rubric is clear, it sounded like some of you have had experience with rubrics in the past, either at a community college class or perhaps in high school or in middle school. And so I think it'll be a new experience for some of you, and that's okay. It's not anything you need to be worried about. In my experience, it usually increases your grade, largely because it's telling you, maybe you're over here in this pink section. It tells you what you need to do to be able to get to the green. This is what you need. This is the skill that we're asking you to do. I'll talk about this in a second, but this actually correlates, or it links up to the learning outcomes from the end of each section. I'm sorry, the beginning of each section and then the summaries at the end. And so you'll want to think about it that way. In particular, the one I gave you, because it's so important in this class, the one I gave you as an example for the syllabus is actually used in week 5. That's the first time you're going to use it. And so you're going to be learning for 4 weeks a new way of thinking, a new language, new ideas to think about for constitutional law, and then you're going to start applying it in week 5. And so that's where I'm going to use this rubric, is on the 3 case analysis assignments from week 5 for the next few weeks after that. Obviously there's no rubric for the points, right, for those early assignments for quiz 1 and quiz 2 that's coming up, and then each of the discussion board posts. I can make one for you if necessary on the discussion board, but most of you have been pretty good with that so far, right? You answered the question that was asked of you, and you referred to the reader and provided a page number. That's really a best practice. You'll also see in the midterm, I'll talk about a little bit in a second, there will be a way to use the rubrics, and you'll see how to do that. So again, this is a combination of points and rubrics. And so let me do the points here for a second. So most of your classes, whether you realize this or not, and it's always tricky, it's easier to do this in person as students realize that this is how they're being graded in most of their classes. We're not using a curve, but I will continue to use the curve as a reference and an example because it's so commonly used in your other classes. So basically, in short, put it very simply, the curve basically says if there's 26 students, the 3 of them can get an A, 4 of them can get a D, and then the rest of the students will be scattered between a B and a C. That's kind of before you even start the class. This is the way that it's measured. I gave a graphic here to kind of explain how people think about this. They think, well, those 4 students are they're gonna really excel, and they're gonna show that they go above and beyond what's expected of them. So then the B is really like the person who is starting to move beyond the expectation. They're able to master the concepts and they're using them, they're critically thinking, they're all doing those things, but somehow they're just not doing as much or they're not explaining it as well as the student who gets the A and A+. The C students are those that meet expectations. They do the work, they're struggling through it, they're starting to make sense of it, but they're just not quite getting above the expectations. And then the serious underperformance and the below expectations, those are usually lack of attendance, engagement, or the work is not really following the directions as put. So after 2 weeks in this class, right, this is what I'd be doing if I was using the grading curve, is I'd look at the total points that you've accumulated so far. And so the A's would go to the 45, 41, and the 39.7, and then I'd kind of go through the process. As you can see, most students would get a C, and they're really, 14 to 29, that's a pretty big difference in my opinion, but some of you might say, well, that's about the middle, and so that's what I expect to get a C. But what do you notice here? I think what stands out to you, I guess, would be my question. As a student, you're thinking, I think a lot of you thought that maybe you get graded based on your effort, right? I don't know how anyone would ever measure that, other than you could measure your own effort. But is there definitely a link between your effort and the number of points you have? Not necessarily, right? You might have tried really hard, but maybe didn't understand the material. Maybe you're struggling because you don't have the book yet, and so you're going to make that up, as you go later. Or maybe you're not great at writing out the sentences, right? And so you need to practice that and get better at it. So points don't really necessarily tell me much about what you're learning. It does tell me about, assignment completion, right? You've completed some assignments, and so you're more likely to have points, right? But what do you think they miss? Like, what does it not tell me? Well, it doesn't tell me at all whether you're understanding those concepts that the rubric would tell me, right? It doesn't tell me how you're framing your answers, or whether you're using references from the course book, right? Points don't really give me any information about that. And then also there's always this big question, the students have the 45 points or the 39.7 or the 41. Does that necessarily mean they understand the concepts? No, right? They might, it might be true, but I have no way of knowing that just from points. So I think in my experience, points are helpful to you. They kind of keep you aware of the assignments you've completed. A couple students have emailed me asking about the number of points they received, and I provided the information back to them. Hopefully they'll use that information to improve that response. You can always change your old responses, with the exception of the quizzes, because you get the right answers. And you might think better about what you're going to do in the future. So in this sense, what I'm looking for is, do you actually understand what you're reading? Are you meeting the expectations of a college level student, as in reading comprehension and your ability to apply it? And then how can I help you kind of get through that process? And so I give you a sneak peek here, right? So Unit 1 here tells you what I'm expecting, right? In the introduction, it tells you what it is that you're going to be doing in that unit. And then there's a summary at the end of that unit that kind of goes through the main points that I expect you not to memorize, but to understand, that you understand what those things mean, and maybe you can use them casually in a conversation with your friends, or your family or your coworkers. And then the same thing with section 2, right? There's a difference now that I'm adding on to it. I'm hoping that you'll build off of what you learned in Unit 1, and now you learn these two things together, and again, you'd be able to have conversations kind of hitting these main points, and you'd understand these things. Now, is it a good idea to memorize these things? Sure, right? It doesn't hurt to memorize this if you feel like you can. Maybe you make flashcards, maybe you try to write them out. But it's not required, right? You don't have to do that. It's just a matter of, do you understand these concepts, and maybe what is surprising to them and what's different about them that you've learned in other classes. Now, I think a good way to do that is, here are all the questions that all of you asked in the first discussion board. And so these are great questions, right? This is a great way to start a course. You have an idea of what you're looking for, and then as you go through the readings, you should be able to answer these questions for yourself, and really ideally, you'd be able to answer them for other students, right? You'd know what the answers are to this question. I'm not going to answer these questions right now. I might answer some of them as we go through the course. Some of them aren't great questions, right? It's a good question for you, but they're not a great question for this course. Maybe they'd be better for a different course. Or maybe they're things that were answered in the textbook already, and so you should have the answers to that. Or maybe you should have learned these things in a previous class. So I'm going to go through these things. It's important for you to know the answer to these questions, but they're not necessarily questions that constitutional lawyers think about, or even constitutional legal scholars, or even criminal justice majors, right? And so I want to try to highlight that as we go. And so those questions will probably become different in your mind, 5 weeks from now, or even 10 weeks from now. So just something to think about, that these are the kind of questions that most students bring into a class. Although I did notice a couple interesting questions that are new, that I haven't seen in 13 years. And so I'll be curious to see where those students kind of take their work. Now, the other big thing that I think can be kind of scary is there's this list of vocabulary words. I think it's important that you know what these words mean and how they mean in this classroom. They're not going to always be the same thing that you would see on a Google search or a Webster's dictionary. These are things that are particular to the field of constitutional law. So this is the way that if you want to do well in this class, this is the way you need to think about these particular words. Now again, would it be helpful to memorize these? Sure, it wouldn't hurt. It's not a bad idea to memorize these things. Again, maybe you make flashcards. Flashcards are just little cards, right, that you put on one side, you put the word, so you put legal reasoning, and then on the other side, the flip side, you put the definition, and then you quiz yourself, right? Or maybe you have somebody else quiz you. It's a good idea. The second thing, though, is that you should be able to use these. So what I'm really thinking would be a good idea is you practice using these phrases and use sentences or talk in paragraphs or ask questions to your family, your friends, and your coworkers. That's a really good way of learning, right? It's a good way to get them to think about these issues with you. So assuming that you do those things, right, then we get into how this kind of works, how the rubric works with the learning outcomes. So you'll notice that each unit has a set of learning outcomes. And so this is what you should be able to do after you go through that chapter or that unit. After you do the readings, you think about them, you start to critically analyze them, you take notes, you have conversations with your family and friends, you make flashcards, you take the quizzes, right? You use the discussion boards. After all that hard work you put in, this is really what you should be able to do. So what I did is I've gone through student work from over the years, and I've thought about, okay, so what do students usually do to get an A, right? What are the kinds of things that they talk about? How do they show me that they understand the material? And then where do students struggle? And so that's what I've kind of shown you here. So green is kind of go, right? And pink is kind of stop, like it's like a red and green, right? So on the far end, this is where students kind of start. They haven't done the readings. They haven't thought about these issues. This is a new concept to them. And so this is what they're struggling with. And as they kind of work it out, they start getting closer, they're getting there, and then finally they get there. You got it. This is kind of what they tend to do. This is not necessarily exactly how you're going to do it. I can't say for sure how you're going to do it, but I will, usually I'll see a little pattern here where I'll say, well, students tend to do it this way, and this is what you're doing. And so if you want to get out of that box, right, you're going to have to change the way that you think, or you have to change the way that you're answering, or maybe you have to go back and do another reading. And so again, these rubrics, which I'll provide in a PDF form that you can look through, I don't want you to get overwhelmed by them. Largely, this is for me and you to use to communicate to each other, and I'm happy to go over in more detail with these things as we go through the course. I just want you to be aware that this is really where learning happens. This is where we can decide, how well you're doing. The points might be helpful. They might give us some information. They might be good for you. But again, the learning outcomes and the rubrics, that's really where we can make sense of all of this. So I don't want you to be overwhelmed. I just want you to be aware that this is a good way of thinking about the class. Now, in week 3 and week 4, we're coming up, right? You're still reading. and you're still trying to really make sense of the things, and then you're really practicing. I'm looking for good answers in your dialogue on Blackboard. And I've noticed so far that the best learning seems to occur when you're responding to another student, right? When you're seeing a difference between you and them. So this isn't really like you say, hey, I think I really liked your answer. That's not what we're doing here, right? It's not like a pat on the back. What you need to be able to do is saying, like, I think you did a really good job, and you show me that you understand the concept. I understand it this way too, but I wonder if, you missed this part. And I did see a couple of that, which I think is great. It's really nice when you see that early on in the semester. It means that it's more likely to have more students be able to do it as we move forward. And so that's what you really want to think about. The quizzes then are really about seeing how much you really remember, right? It's a good way to say, okay, I thought I knew this thing, but then I didn't really quite, know is why I kind of panicked when I saw the question on the screen. And so you want to think about it that way. And what I'm trying to get you to do is to learn a new way to think about constitutional issues. A lot of you talked about just not really knowing what this is about. So this is brand new to you, and I understand that. So we're going to build upon what you already know, or what you thought you knew, but now we're going to modify it a little bit. It's going to be less simple, right? So a lot of you have these really simple ideas about what it is. And it's going to be more refined. You're going to start to be clearer and more concise in your answers, and they're usually going to be a bit more complicated, right? You're going to see life isn't quite black and white. There's a lot of space in the gray. So a lot of it, your answers will start to be, it depends, and you'll say why. This is also that you can learn how to critically analyze, which is one of the main things you have to do in a course like this. This is equivalent to a course at John Jay College, and so you're being asked to do similar things. This really means that you have to look at multiple points of view, not just memorizing your own, and not just memorizing what you think might be ideal view, or what formalists tend to look at, like saying, well, this would be in a perfect world, this is what we'd want everything to work. You really need to get down into the details of what happens in real life. And that's how you're going to better understand what constitutional law really is, and how it works in everyday practice. Now, I want to just give you a heads up, right, because week 5 is where it's really going to start to be useful for me to see how you're doing. And so you're now going to be applying this new method, this new way of learning in a couple weeks to actual cases. And so you're going to see, are you able to use legal language? Are you able to apply the thinking that you've learned so far? And this will be a great time to use the rubrics and really think about your progress and how far you've come. You'll also want to practice this in the discussion board, right? I'm going to have you compare and contrast some readings, and that will be a good time for you to really pay attention to what your classmates are saying and how are they using the reading materials, maybe different than you are, and then in what ways are they similar. And then you'll have the midterm exam to kind of see, how are you applying this new information? Are you able to kind of use it easily? Are you starting to apply these concepts in your answers? You want to take your time and maybe write out your answers and then edit them before you enter them, and just try to have an approach that's going to be useful here for you, and that way I can give you feedback based on how well you're doing up to that point. And so you really want to think about, can you critically analyze now? Do you know how to do that? Can you use new legal language? Is that something that's getting easy for you? You're not going to use every single word in that vocabulary list. But if you're using 5 or 6, that's really good. You're doing a really good job at that point. Those are 5 or 6 new words that you didn't know just 5 weeks earlier. Can you discuss this new learning with your classmates? Can I see evidence that you really actually are engaged in the process and you're learning the material in your conversations with each other? Are you really getting into the details in these discussion boards? Are you able to write a college level response, right? Again, this is something that you need to be able to do at this level, and you need to be able to do this well. And so I'm going to give you feedback on how you're doing on that. I'm not necessarily talking about grammar, right? Grammar can be something that's pretty subjective, right? We all speak differently in our own communities and our own backgrounds, but it should be clear, right? No matter how you speak, it should be clear what you're saying, right? Your ideas should be clear, right? They should be formulated in such a way that you're relating the material to your lived experience. And so I want to see, are you able to do that? Are you able to get your message or your point across? After the midterm, I'm going to have a much better idea of what you're able to do and what you should focus on for the remaining weeks. You should take more time at that point after the midterm and really take a look at the rubrics and spend some time thinking about what you're doing well, what you need to work on, and really try to think about what you want to focus on, right? And we can work together on that. And then think about what you're doing and what you need to do. Like, you know, where have you been, and then what is it you need to do to get to the place that you want to be. I want to give you just a couple examples of the kind of questions and how you'll be thinking about it for the midterm in week 5. Here's one, you know, from the actual midterm. Choose a statement from the very specific pages and explain what it means to you. Don't copy and paste it, right? Don't give me a summary of it. I know sometimes you're used to doing that in high school, but now I'm asking you, what does this mean to you? Show me. You know, are you still arguing the society should be based on the ideal of equality? Everyone should just get along? That's a D answer, right? You need to improve that answer. Are you able to show me that there's unequal power relationships going on, and this is how interpretation matters and how the law is not clear, right? How it's malleable, how it can change depending on the circumstances. That's what I'm really looking for. It'll give me some good language that you're using to say, okay, this is what this student thinks about this so far. And then I'm going to have you take 5 of the vocabulary words and use them in a sentence, right? Think about legality. There's a definition of that provided in the textbook. This is saying how much are you understanding? Are you able to use this information? And then another example here is to start talking about the tension, right? What we call dual constitutionalism. There's the idea for social control. It's a way to order society or try to order society. But that domination, that ordering definitely creates a tension. There's resistance. There's people don't want to be abused. They want the government to have limits. And so you want to be able to argue and talk about that in a way that uses the materials from the course book. I'm going to keep saying that over and over again. A answers on this right-hand side are those that refer to the course materials so that you show me you're understanding what's going on in this class. Now again, these are just 3 examples from the exam, but they're pretty good examples to tell you what you need to be focusing on and how to prepare. Now I want to just kind of highlight for a second then where you're coming from. Where did you start, right? So if you've got these questions wrong, don't feel bad. You didn't know, right? You just started the course. So there's 51 constitutions in the United States. Each state has its own constitution, and then there's the federal constitution. This is something we would have hoped that you would have learned in your American government class or in high school. But again, it's okay if you didn't, because as you'll see, most students get this wrong. And so you're all kind of in the same boat. We now want you to understand, right, that there's 51 constitutions. The point, though, is not that you memorize the number of constitutions. The point is that you understand why does it matter that each state has their own constitution and that it might be different than the federal constitution. Well, this is partially we want you to understand federalism, right? That each state is required to have a Republican form of government. This doesn't mean Republican as in Democrats and Republican, although at one point it did kind of have a reference to that, but not anymore. What it means is that the Republican form of government is one that's pretty familiar to you. You are going to elect people that are supposed to be representative of your interests, and then those people go about and deal with government. They run society while you go to work or you go to school or you go to your house, right? That's the system of government. There are different systems of government. I gave you a few options here, right? There's an aristocratic government, there's tyranny, there's socialist governments, there's communist governments. There's all sorts of different ways of organizing a society. This is just one of them, but it's in the Constitution. The federal Constitution requires that each state had a Republican government. So as much as people might want socialism, they might say we really want socialism in America, you'd have to change the Constitution in order for that to be constitutional, right? It would be against the Constitution for a state to change its form of government. Now, this is also becomes tricky then. Do you have a Fourth Amendment right in New York City? The answer is no. No. The federal government does not rule New York City. You might want them to, and you might want a Fourth Amendment right in New York City, but there's no Fourth Amendment right in the state constitution of New York. There is no Fourth Amendment right. There's a much greater tendency to protect society, to protect the social order. There is not an explicit right to unwarranted search and seizure in the state of New York. And this is what really leads to the Floyd versus New York case and stop and frisk. Right now, a court has said that New York has to change its stop and frisk policies, but they did not grant a specific right to people. They just said that this particular right violates the 14th Amendment, not the 4th Amendment. So I just want to show you how not knowing how many constitutions in the United States shows me you don't necessarily understand the federalism and how the system works, even though you might be able to get that answer correct, and then you'll get the wrong answer on a constitutional legal analysis of the Fourth Amendment, right? I don't know is the best answer on that one because you haven't learned how to analyze constitutional legal issues. So I just want to show you again, you're building off of what you know and things you don't know. This is again repeated when it goes to how many Supreme Court justices does the Constitution require. The Constitution does not specifically say how many justices there need to be. Now, logic would dictate, because it says that there has to be a Supreme Court, that you'd have to have at least one human being on that court. And it could be that way. There could be as few as 3. There could also be as many as 12. It's an argument that Joe Biden and others are making. Franklin Delano Roosevelt made that argument in the 30s, that there should be more. I personally think it's a good idea. There should be more Supreme Court justices. But the political issue we have now, it's not the Constitution requires it. Congress has set 9 judges, and so that's how many we have. Now, are criminal courts required by the U.S. Constitution? The answer is yes. It's in the Constitution that everyone who's accused of a crime is guaranteed a jury trial. And so you have to have criminal courts in order to have those trials. However, 95% of people never get a criminal trial. They don't get a jury trial. So some people would say that's a violation of the United States Constitution. Others would say, no, I don't think it is, right? So just because the Constitution requires something doesn't mean that that thing is happening. There's also issues that people have been tried in military tribunals, right? So they've been accused of a crime, but they didn't have a trial in a normal criminal court. They had a special court. And so again, it's more about what the Constitution doesn't say and how people interpret it. And so this really leads us to this other question about, what do you think, right? Reproductive choice right now is a big question in the courts, and it's very unclear, right? After Roe v. Wade, it was clear. Everybody thought that there was a right to reproductive choice and that it couldn't be taken away except for in the 3rd trimester in the last 90 days. But now it's unclear. The court has changed their mind on that. And so now they're saying, no, each state gets to decide whether they want to allow for the right to reproductive choice. And so some states, many states, have said, no, you don't have the right. And other states say, yes, you do. But it's not in the Constitution, right? The Constitution doesn't say explicitly that you have the right to reproductive choice. Now, if you're just thinking that's about women, you're wrong, right? Men, some very clever students have come up with ways in which let's say if women were in charge of the government, in which they could limit your reproductive choice and what you're allowed to do with your body and what you waste when you don't create a life in your sexual practices. And so, again, this choice isn't just limited to women. This is no humans have reproductive choice regardless of their gender and sexuality in the Constitution. It's not in there. And so the Supreme Court has tried to argue at one point that you should have it, and then now the Supreme Court has argued you shouldn't have it. So you'll fall somewhere in there, and you see there's a lot of variation, right, in your classmates' answers. So I hope this wasn't too overwhelming. I just want to give you a good idea of where you're at and what we're doing. For those of you who are struggling, right, I just want you to know we can Zoom and talk, right? I'm available. Students do take me up on this. We have one-on-one sessions. It's kind of like a tutoring session with your professor. Very few students get this chance in college. This is something that is much more likely to happen at community college. Once you transfer, it's very unlikely that you're going to get a one-on-one session with your professor. So take advantage of it. If you're interested in going to law school, I can help you think about that, right, as a law school graduate. Or if you're interested in becoming a lawyer or a judge, right, I can help you think about that. If you're interested in social organizations or change rights organizations, I can help you with that. I can steer you in different directions for transfer options, right? There's lots of things I can help you with in addition to how you're understanding the course. Now, email is okay for a lot of things, right? It's not a bad thing. There's nothing wrong with it. And I try as quickly, to respond to you as quickly as possible, assuming that you don't email me at 4 o'clock in the morning. One student, who I'm talking to. I'll get to you a little bit later. I'm not quite up that early. But it can also lead to miscommunication, right? And we might not understand each other. Email is not so clear. And so, right, I'm trying to explain the best way I can. And I see sometimes you get frustrated, and I can't explain any other way over email, right? The words I'm using are the only words I can think of. And so tone is really difficult to figure out, right? Is somebody happy? Are they upset? Are they frustrated? It's really hard to know over email. So that's where we should have a Zoom. That way I can share my screen. I can show you, what I need you to do. I can make things clear to you, or you can share your screen and show me what you see. This is kind of a good way to discuss things one-on-one so that there's no miscommunication. Maybe all your professors don't offer that, but I do. So I'm happy to do that with you, provided we find a time that we both can do it. So I can also do, in the past, students have asked me to do special topics, right? They have, maybe going back to those questions you had in the discussion board post from week 1, maybe you want me to talk about a specific issue. I'm happy to do that. I also get asked to do talks all over the city, right? So I've done presentations on environmental rights. I've done issues related to racism, to sexism. I've done talks on reproductive rights and abortion. I'm sure I'm forgetting others. Comparative constitutional law, right? So how constitutional law works in other countries. And so terrorism. I've talked lots of things. So if you want me to do a special topic, I can do one. I can make a video like this, or we can have an optional volunteer, non-mandatory. If you can come, you can, and we'll have a conversation. I can do that also for certain topics in the class. It's really up to you. I'll respond to what you need. So I just want to make sure you have all these options and that you have a good sense of what we're doing, and let you know I'm here. I'm a human. You can see my face if we do a Zoom. And again, just let me know if you need anything. And hopefully now you've got the book, or you will be getting the book soon, because that's going to become super important by next week.